And I will now start. Hi, everybody, and a really warm welcome to our latest webinar from WOA. We're delighted to be able to bring you this session, following on from our very successful physical meeting in Mainz in Germany, back to our series of webinars discussing some of the key topics, key issues which are going on around us at the moment. Today, we're going to be looking at supply chain futures. We're going to be looking at the impact of trends and the direction in cross-border factoring and receivables finance. I think it's fair to say that with the seismic shock of the situation that's been going on in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, the impact of sanctions, the disruption of the energy supply markets, high inflation across Europe, the States, COVID effects, especially still in China, the nature and vulnerability of supply chains has never been more obvious or more at the fore of our thinking. So what can we expect to see, and what are the implications for our industry? I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you are, by industry expert Steven van der Hooft of Capital Chains. Hi, Steven. Lionel Taylor, Head of Trade Advisory Network. Hello, Lionel, welcome. And Richard Hawkins, CEO of Atlantic Risk Management. Hi, Richard.
Hi.
And these industry experts will help guide us through some of these issues and the implications in this currently very challenging and volatile environment. So thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. That's very good of you. And to our audience out there, what I would like to say is that, we are going to make this as interactive as possible. So do please ask us questions if you have them. And if they're relevant to the topic at the moment, then we'll try and introduce them to the conversation. If they're general or on a different subject, then we'll try and tackle them towards the later part of the webinar. So, gentlemen, where are we now? What's the current situation? How are we reading the market? What are the things that are influencing and driving change in the market? Where's this all going to lead? And let's put our thinking caps on and say, where do we think the markets are going to be, say, in 12 months' time? And if that's the case, what are the implications for the products and providers? So a wide range of conversation to take place. But maybe to start a little bit back to the basics, let's talk about what happens in trade flows, the cash conversion cycle. What is being impacted on that by what's going on in the world today? How's it influenced change? Lionel, perhaps if I could pass the baton over to you and really talk about where you see the trade flows at the moment and what has been impacting them.
Yeah, thanks, John, and hi, everyone. First of all, apologies. I have a cough, which will occasionally take over, but I'm going to cough now I said that. But I'll do my best. I mean, we are in very interesting times. And I'd like to begin by remembering the first recession. And you can get the theme of where I might be going here. The first recession, I was when I was in the industry, my mentor at the time was a guy called John Butterworth, and we'd set up the Royal Bank of Scotland's factoring business. And we were all moaning and groaning. And he said, guys, we've got to treat this as normal times. So whatever the conditions, you've got to say these are normal times. And what we're seeing, and certainly what we've been seeing in our business, we're talking with banks, non-banks, corporates, investors, is there's been a number of shifts in the way supply chains work. Obviously, we had even pre-COVID, we had the trade conflict between the US and China. We've then had COVID, where lots of the world closed down, and we're seeing in China there is still, zero tolerance to COVID. And these are, if you think China is the manufacturing center of the world, how that's affected. We've had all the problems post-COVID around the movement of freight. Had that problem in the Suez Canal for 6 days. And we've now obviously got a war in Europe, in Russia and Ukraine. And all these are affecting the way supply chains work. And certainly, I think there's been a shift from what used to be a lean manufacturing and just in time to businesses being forced to carry more inventory. Currently, people are looking at their supply chains. They're looking at whether they should be moving towards nearshoring or onshoring of those supply chains. It's a lot easier if you're a larger business in a sense to equip yourself and plan for these things. But if you're a smaller business and an SME, it's marginally difficult to try and work out what you should or should not be doing. And certainly we're seeing at the moment, as we head towards the autumn, certainly in Europe, a squeeze on cash for these smaller companies. We're starting to see the tightening up in the world. You know, people are fearful of what's happening in the economies and inflation. If you're in the UK at the moment, you've got a lot of political turmoil, as well as problems with around the value of currency and the value of the pound. All these things for a small businessman are major headaches because they haven't got a real sense of what they should do. So there's quite a bit of, I think, confusion in that market. But generally speaking, we're starting to see a tightening up in larger companies protecting their supply chains where they need to, smaller companies starting to suffer, you know, as the economic situation bites.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. Stephen, I mean, do you see this also as being principally affecting SMEs, or do you see it more across the board?
I think in general, this will affect SMEs the most. Corporates will always have access to cash. They are typically better placed in attracting funds from various sources. I think one of the things that you will see more and more in the coming months is also the effect of individuals or smaller companies running into distress, thereby trying to save their own operations. And one of the things that they will do is use whatever working capital they've got for their own operations, meaning they will pay their suppliers or their contractors late, pushing others into even a bigger dependency on working capital needs. And I think that is going to be the critical theme over the next few months. Is one, if we're moving from just in time to just in case, that means I need to carry more inventory. And then if that at the same time, I'm having the issue of not knowing where to get my working capital from and being squeezed by other parties in my supply chain, I will be in definite need of more working capital solutions. And I think that's going to be the crux for the next few months for the industry to tackle, is how do we go about without giving out free cash? I mean, obviously, we know what's happening, so we need to keep all of the risk parameters in check as well.
Mm-hmm. And Richard, are you seeing in your business the effects of cash starvation yet, or is that sort of still next down the line?
I think we're in that build-up phase right now. Yeah, my view is that we're going to see greater impact of current working capital requirements that are declining as we get into January of next year. You think about an awful lot of industries are what you call back-end season loaded, which means that multiple businesses actually have their biggest sales periods between September and December. So we're in that situation where we're having the inventory build right now. The sales are beginning to ramp up as we go into that season. The problem is that as we come out of that season, the performance of those businesses may be less than expected, and therefore you're going to get a big cash hemorrhage when you come into the early part of next year. And I think that's you know, both in certain sectors, but also I think that's across the board in terms of countries. So yeah, we're beginning to see an increasing level of concern out there regarding the availability of working capital and how well the season goes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
maybe to add, John. Sorry. I was going to say, maybe to add, one of the things that I see in Europe, taking the Netherlands as an example as well, is after COVID or during COVID, we had loads of government intervention programs. You could delay payment of taxes. You would have subsidies for keeping your personnel employed. All of that, let's say, came to an end a couple of months ago, and we are now seeing the period where this starts to, well, you need to repay, right? So a lot of SMEs, particularly, who were hit by COVID first, then were, let's say, hit by all of the economic fallout that follows, now being hit by high prices for energy and repayment plans. So I think that's all going to add up on top of what we see coming from the today's economy into what they got from yesterday's problems.
I think that's a very good point that Steve is making, and certainly we're seeing some of our clients are complaining that there are companies, let's say across Europe, who receive these government support and are moving on to repayments, and actually there are some, rather than going on to repayments, are actually forcing their own administration so they can close and set up again. And some lenders are starting to get concerned about that. And I was talking to one lender yesterday who was stating that they're now looking at, in the UK, those that had what were called CBIL loans as being a potential problem as opposed to anything else, because there is a concern that they can just simply go into administration and then set up the next day, and then there's a debt left, and often it's not just the government that's got a debt left, it's others as well.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Two aspects of that. I was at a conference last week in Ireland, a credit management conference, and very much there's a sense of foreboding as they see pressures actually building, which I think reflects a little bit what Richard was saying there. That there are signs of it, but it's sort of how big is it? And how quickly is it going to happen? I think also one of the things that we've seen this year, which has seemed a little counterintuitive, is that in the first 6 months of the year, the turnover through receivables finance in Europe was massively up compared to the first half of 2021, on average nearly 20% higher. And that's an extraordinary increase, and it really sort of sets the bells ringing of, well, why is that happening? And of course, perhaps half of that is likely to be a direct result of inflation, simply prices going up, tracking inflation. But also, I think that to Stephen's point, the repayment of some of the government support systems schemes is actually meaning that many SMEs are looking to find working capital, and also this move towards shorter and more reliable supply chains is also creating a working capital requirement. So I think part of the growth that we've seen in the first year is illusory because it's simply inflation. Part of it is real because it's responding to demand in the marketplace. Yeah,
but there's also been a post-COVID lockdown boom as well. So a lot of people, as a result of lockdown, went out and they bought holidays, they bought stuff they couldn't buy, they bought clothes, and therefore we had a retail boom that happened on the back of that. A lot of people had savings as a result of lockdown because they were sitting at home and they weren't going out, and they were still getting relatively high levels of their remuneration. A lot of people, even on furlough, were better off by not having to travel to work. And that meant they built up savings, so they spent that savings. So that boom is sort of a part of the growth we've seen across factoring and receivables financing industry in the last sort of 6 months or so. It was actually that post-COVID boom. That post-COVID boom is definitely now gone, because those same consumers are now facing higher increases in electricity, higher increases in rate, taxes are going up or staying the same, so on and so forth, and less job security. So we've gone from this sort of mini boom to what I think is going to be a contraction, a consumer contraction.
Yes.
And just going to the point, Lionel, just follow this, just close on that. Just going back to, the first recession, this recession is going to be more like a traditional recession in that it's consumer-led. Whereas before, the last recession was actually because of the bank issues, because of the liquidity issues within the banking system. This is going to be more like a traditional recession in that it is consumer-led. It is going to be a demand suppressed or supply chain led recession.
I was going to say, but it's not all doom and gloom. I mean, it's there is opportunity, and I think for those providers of receivables finance in whatever form, there is going to be a lot of opportunity, because normally what happens is we see the banks generally start to close the doors quite rapidly and across the board. And I think if you're a non-bank finance provider at the moment, as long as you make sure you keep the back door closed and you are careful with your existing portfolio, there are opportunities, maybe with some extra filtering, as was, I think, mentioned before. You were still going to have the risk disciplines in place to pick up some pretty good business. But, you've got to be quite picky as to what you pick up. And, certainly, if I was back practicing, I would, be looking at some of the key markers in a business, that reflect this environment we're in, whether it's, do they have high energy costs? Do they already have high interest costs, which we know are probably going to double or whatever? You look at the metrics, but there is still going to be business opportunity.
And that's, I think, an interesting point in terms of, the adaptability of organisations. The NBIFs that you mentioned, one area. Increasingly, we've been seeing across Europe the arrival and opportunities arising for fintechs, new providers. And how do you see them reacting to this environment? What are their opportunities and what are their risks?
You begin, Richard.
Yeah, I think so. A lot of the new companies, whether or not they call themselves fintechs or alternative finance business operating in the traditional receivable space or commercial loan space, are very, very vulnerable at this time. A lot of them have had trouble in terms of generating enough revenue to recover costs, and now they're looking at potential frailty within their existing loan books. So there could be more damage in relation to high levels of bad debt and delinquency within their portfolios. So those that have got a very, very strong business model, good operating model, know their sector, know the market well, should do okay. For those that have any level of vulnerability, that vulnerability is going to be more tested as we go over the next sort of 3 to 6 months, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree totally with that. Certainly, I think, as I mentioned before, I'm old enough to have lived through a number of recessions. Some of the very clever people running some of the fintech businesses have never seen a recession yet in their professional lives. And I think some of them will be in for a shock, especially where their solution is very much geared to that sort of single invoice, receivable, as opposed to having a track record with a client where you can spot trends and see what's going on, which is, what we used to always live by. So I think there are great dangers there for them, and they've also got the danger that they're trying to, they've got investors, many of them, who are demanding returns, and the investor community that we deal with are really indicating that they're not seeing the returns that were promised. So you have a situation where they're putting pressure on some of these fintechs for the return. In the fintechs, that can lead to to short-termism in terms of doing business that they shouldn't be doing just to get revenue through the door. So there are dangers, but the well-organized ones and the ones that have maybe got spread in their books, so they're not concentrated in one particular sector or one particular client, have got a very good chance to make hay, in a sense, while others are suffering.
I think also it's going to come down to, do you really understand the business that you're in, right? So that there are so many new technology providers who attach the fin to their tech, where they say, well, we're really good at creating technology, we can do finance as well, whether that is on pure invoice financing or it's on distributor finance, it's I don't know, deep tier supply chain finance. It's going to come down to their ability to understand what it is that they're actually financing. Do they understand the risks present in that value chain? Have they got the right metrics in place to understand well, even if they are doing single invoice finance, right? Do they have metrics in place that will allow them to understand trend breaches where, hey, it used to be 1,000, it's 2,000 now. That doesn't make sense. Hey, it was always 500. It's 100 now. What does that mean down the line? I think that level of understanding of what you're actually financing is gonna have to go up. And I've been advocating that for the past few years, even when there's no recession, because I think that is what is needed, a solid understanding of those value chains, a good understanding of the nature of the trade, and then the technology is there to help you automate things and make things easier, but you are going to need that insight.
Yes, I think it might not be directly in our everyday line of businesses, but I think a real clear example of this is in the buy now, pay later markets, where the valuation of Klarna, who were the market leaders, has absolutely crashed. And the issue is, of course, that the cost of funding so-called free credit installments is rocketing as base rates increase, and it's becoming quite unsustainable. And these businesses that weren't actually even making money, operating profits in the first place, are now shooting further into the red. And I think it's putting a real big question mark over the sector. So there are structural issues as well as competence issues. But I'm interested really to follow up on this idea of the knowledge and awareness and understanding. We most of us are dealing with people on the provider side, the supplier side of this industry. How do we feel about the level of knowledge and competence that there is in the provider side? Are we comfortable with it? I got the impression that maybe there's a suggestion that it's an area that needs some attention.
Well, I think it always needs attention, to be honest. I mean, people who know myself and John Bouget, we always talk about trade cycle analysis. We always talk about, basically understand the business and understand the supply chains and the trade flows of the businesses that you're looking to service. So how we grew up, and I don't think that's ever changed. And there are lots of tools available now to help you understand. But I think there's this rush I often see. Rush to do business without understanding. And I think Stephen hit the nail on the head, is sometimes, people are financing without really getting to grips as to what are they financing and what are the sort of almost threats and potential mitigants maybe around what they're financing. There does seem to be a rush to do business sometimes. We're certainly seeing with the training that we do, there's been more and more call for that training. And it's not just about, the different techniques of supply chain finance. It's how do you run a good program? How do you manage a portfolio? And a lot of this is coming from banks overseas, to be honest. Whereas the sort of the Western banks, I think, generally believe they have it, sewn up. But we're seeing a lot more interest in how do we manage something correctly? What should we be thinking about? Which might be a sign of the times, I don't know. But, to me, there's, with all the training in the world, we've all dealt with SMEs in our pasts where they've been great people and then they go and commit a fraud. And they're not professional fraudsters. The guy that has to pay the wages on a Friday thinks, I can get away with a bit of fresh air invoicing or something. You see, it worked, I'll do it again and again. So there are some things where you can understand everything, but human nature might step in where the desperate person would do something more desperate. And I'm sure Richard probably knows more about that than I do.
Thanks, Lionel. Yeah. Without doubt. I mean, the general point about the human resources within the sector, it's a dangerous time in view of the fact there's a lack of exposure to recession. The amount of in-house training that takes place in banks and financial organizations now is virtually nil. There's been exacerbated by the lockdown, working from home, people joining organizations where they haven't sat next to somebody that's been there 5-10 years. So their learning is being constricted by that. We're facing, circumstances now which are going to be very, very different to the ones they've been looking at in the previous sort of 10 years. So I think that the human resource is going to become a big issue. And, going back to your point, Lionel, about fraud, there's two things in connection with fraud that people sort of need to, get their head around. First one is actually being able to identify it. And that's fine. And there's various tools out there, and some people will continue to miss the signs, and they get there late. And then the second one is actually, what do you do when you find out that you've got one? And there's almost like a complete lack of understanding in terms of how to deal with that aspect of it. Is what do you do when you find out you've got a fraud? What is the first thing that you do? And a lot of people really just don't understand what to do about that, so they tend to make bad decisions early. Making bad decisions early just will compound the problem, actually make it more expensive. So I think that, there needs to be far more awareness of what the dangers are out there, and also the capability of actually addressing those problems.
Yeah, again, I think bitter experience also shows that where fraud does take place, it also has quite a bad cultural effect, knock-on effect within the organization, because what it tends to do is create an environment of fear and risk aversion. And people then start becoming far too conservative in the way they do business. They start saying no to things that they should say yes to. And as a result of that, there is a real opportunity cost. And I've seen that in a number of organizations where the sort of the loss of business and loss of opportunity is actually an order of magnitude greater than the original loss that they suffered through the fraud. So it's quite pernicious.
But that's where that creates the opportunity, though, John, doesn't it, for those others in the market? But I mean, you're hearing. I mean, I had this with one of the banks last week, and it was a relatively, we'll call it a new bank, and more of a digital bank, and they didn't understand the concept of a workout. Their view was, if something, if a client went bust, they'd just get a debt collector in. But everything would flow back in naturally. And then the bit that's not flowing in, they'll just use debt collection. There was no, to us it seems like common sense. You've got to work through the portfolio to get the best result, but they've not had that experience.
Yeah. Just, going back to your point, John, as well. I mean, it psychologically impacts the people that have to deal with it. It's sort of akin to somebody robbing your house. There's a big psychological impact of somebody that's actually come in and sort of, messed around with your furniture and stuff like that. People feel that if, a client in their portfolio has done that damage to them, a lot of people end up psychologically damaged by that in terms of, being able to cope with this idea. So it's sort of understandable why the human reaction would be pretty negative when that has happened to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I often tell people, the reason I have no hair is because so many times have I been a victim of frauds, and I think fortunately we were able to make more money elsewhere. But
so are you actually then filming this from your prison cell at the moment, John?
It's a very comfortable cell. I mean, yes. I'm watching the time, ticking the days away before my ultimate release. Absolutely.
But I just want to make one more point on people. And it's something that we were just talking about before the session started. There's a lot of AI, artificial intelligence, and a lot of tools out there to help finance providers manage risk. And some of them, are very useful and very helpful in helping spot that either risks that are happening or potential risks. But at the end of the day, you still need that human being. You still need that person who can take that information and then work out how they use that information to best, keep their business safe.
And it's also going to provide them with more confidence, right? If they have a good understanding of what they're doing and AI is there to help them, they can actually focus on all of the outliers that they would typically miss because they were too busy following up on the wrong items. So it's going to provide them with more confidence that what they're doing actually makes sense. And hopefully It will stop them from saying no to everything because they're too risk averse.
And absolutely, anything that you can help that helps, as the expression says, see the wood for the trees, I think is the most powerful thing that these analytical tools can provide you. Again, it also requires a bit of training and implementation, because it's very easy for them to over-report and provide, attention reports that swamp the users. So getting that balance right of sort of good exception reporting is I think an ongoing challenge for any of the providers.
If it's giving you more than 20% of the portfolio, it's probably not working, or you've got a terrible portfolio.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's great. In terms of, we've said that we see the environment as being quite challenging, but as Lionel said quite rightly, that there are opportunities that come out of that. Let's put our thinking hats on, our positive hats on, and say, there is a great deal of uncertainty out there, but if we're looking forward over the next 6-12 months, what are the things that we actually think are going to happen? What are the opportunities which are going to arise out of this, and what do people need to be taking account of in terms of shaping their organizations to take advantage of those opportunities?
Shall I start?
Yeah, please do, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it goes back to know your client. It's with the greater depth of understanding you have, the more likely you're going to be in a position to help and to help those successful businesses and to enable them to become more successful. In practical terms, that does mean extending the capability, the financing capability. And it probably means that you need to look at being able to finance inventory in better, more locations. There are new changes in law that are enabling, electronic shipping documentation. Could be a very, very, very big game changer. And I think Lionel can speak to that subject. So I think there's going to be opportunities out there, but it is that question of picking winners and managing the ones that are doing not so well. But yeah, I've certainly been able to extend facilities to be able to finance more inventory in various locations based upon, better documentation and, higher traceability and transparency in relation to that collateral and where it is.
Excellent. But Lionel, you perhaps can take up that point. But just before we ask you to do so, can I just again remind the audience, we'd really appreciate your views and your thoughts on these topics. It is participative, so do either give us a question or state a view, and we'd be delighted to take that on board. So please take part. But Lionel, back to you.
Okay, I mean, in terms of, I think digitization is a huge opportunity, and what's happening in the world I would say it's probably one of the biggest positives that came out of COVID was this realization that our reliance on paper faltered. We could see all the frailties of paper as a medium, and what's happening? I mean, basically around the world, various countries are putting through regulation and laws that invariably allow for the admissibility of an electronic record as being something tangible. So if it's something tangible, it means you can take possession of it, which means you can then transfer it. And if you look at things like financial instruments, bills of exchange, promissory notes, they are rarely set for a digital world. And they're instruments that have been in place, well used, they're I think tremendous instruments, but have always been dogged by the amount of bureaucracy and paper and time it takes, etc. That goes away, that creates a massive opportunity that I think can also strengthen the way in which finance providers offer some of their receivables type facilities and what have you. And that regulation, it's not pie in the sky. In the UK, the first reading last week in the UK Parliament of a bill that basically creates the validity of those electronic records. France is rushing through, the rest of Europe is rushing through. France is very much geared to trying to beat the UK at the moment. All this, not as a central government, but in the sort of federal states in the US, all are starting to put through the regulation that basically allows for this digitization, this electronic record. And of course, that will then extend on to bills of lading. There's a lot of work being done by various associations, you know, not just banking associations, but logistics and others getting together so that we do create this digital environment. And it's never been the technology that's the issue. It's generally been the amount of regulation and laws, and in terms of bills of lading, the amount of parties involved that has caused a complexity. But a lot of that is starting to be wiped away. So I think that's going to create a tremendous change in the industry as a whole, whether you're an existing bank or non-bank, but all players. And it's how you use that digitization, how you use that access to more information to help your business lend better, finance better, as both Richard and Stephen have said, understand what you're doing and who you're providing your services to. So I think there's a tremendous wave, positive wave coming forward. Maybe as we move out of an economic climate to one of hopefully growth again. And, you know, again, those of us who are old enough and long enough in the tooth, we know that recessions come in cycles, you know, and quite frankly, if we hadn't had COVID and we didn't have all these government incentives, that recession would have come earlier. You know, that's what normally happens, you know, and you do get companies who are unfortunately too weak and too stretched that go out of business, but then others take the place. So if you get that happening, you've got this change of laws and regulations around the world around supporting electronic records and digitization. I think there's a recipe there for very, very good business going forward for our industry.
And I think from the consumer side, right? So from the corporates or SMEs actually using all of these services, I think there's an expectation on their end for more inclusive offerings. Inclusive not meaning who you include or not, but what you're offering or not. I think at the moment, what you see is you'll be working with a bank for A, you'll be working with fintech number 1 for offering B, you'll be working with fintech number C, can't remember which letters or numbers, but you have all these providers of individual solutions. And especially now that you've seen the need in supply chains for more overarching solutions. It's not just you or me needing finance, it's me and my suppliers, it's me and my distributors, it's me and my vendors at the corner of the street who need financing. I think what we're going to see as well is more bringing together of all of these offerings into either platforms of platforms. So from a digitization perspective, someone who sits on top of it, or providers who will be able to aggregate more of the supply chain data and facilitate financing based on that. Because corporates actually expect that they can do supplier side, buyer side financing with one entity, because they want to have that overview. So where Lionel's speaking about, let's say, the facilitation of these offerings through rules and regulations, I think it's also based on an expectation that it should be simple, it should be easy. And I think that is going to be a challenge for many of these providers who actually come from, we're really good at invoicing and hence we do reverse factoring, or we're really good at physical supply chain management. We have tracking data on where the container is and we can finance that. That's going to be a challenge. And whether that's 12 months, don't know, but that's definitely on the table at the moment.
It's interesting because that expression, that idea of being able to provide a continuous linear funding process right from the original first purchase order right through to the end sale and user seems to have been a bit of a nirvana of the finance industry for as long as I've ever been in it. And a little bit like nuclear fusion, which is going to solve all our problems, is just 5 years down the line. We never seem quite to get there. I think that, you know, the technology certainly has the potential for that, but this integration of the systems, the processes, the legalities still is a major challenge for us, I think. And you know, when one thinks about sort of blockchain solutions, we've also got the added complication that the extensive utilization of those is going to melt the ice caps. It's all going to be quite challenging to get it in place. But I do think I agree absolutely. This sort of closer integration and you know, being able to move through that process, at least bumping the sides a few less times, is really coming, and that's going to be beneficial for everyone.
But it will create its challenges. I mean, you know, double financing, stuff like that. And again, these things have to be set up in the right way. So the old disciplines don't go away. You know, it's, I think was mentioned before about, you know, this technology, digitization, you know, it doesn't matter what the root of the technology is, whether it's blockchain or not, it's creating something. It's giving an advantage that was not there before in terms of speed, in terms of transparency and visibility, but it's what you do with it. And then how you as a finance provider set yourself up. You know, you can have lots of information, but if you're not doing anything with it, who cares? You know, it's really what you do with it and how you frame it into your solutions. You know, I was just going to mention one other thing that we haven't mentioned, which of course is affecting the way supply chains are running at the moment, and some of the metrics going forward is around ESG, that whole, you know, environmental sort of package of measures and controls that are coming in around the world. You know, certainly the treasurers that I've spoken to in the last 12 months will now talk about ESG as an important consideration in how their teams and they themselves are looking at the management and the future of the supply chains.
And it's also one of the drivers why they want these solutions in one place, because they are almost obliged to keep track of the ESG scores of their suppliers, their distributors, etc. And hence there will be that driver. So yes, it's the nirvana, as John, you were mentioning. But I think it's sometimes also more from a practical perspective, where you're not even expecting to have everything in one place, but more of it. And I think the benefit that some of these tech providers have is there is no real legacy. I mean, they've got legacy systems, but it's easier to turn on their feet. And I was actually speaking to a corporate last week where they were saying, hey, we're in this, let's say the change of the business model. So they are doing, how should I call this? They're providing seeds, etc., and fertilizers to the agro business to try and move away from meat. So meat replacement principles. And what they're saying is, well, since we're now setting up this value chain, because it's new, it's there, technically it's there, but we have to grow and scale it. We want an end-to-end solution, and we want to make sure that everyone in this value chain has the capability of benefiting from it, and hence creating incentives for even the farmers to grow the crop beyond, yeah, you grow the crop, we take it, we pay you. If you don't grow it because of nature, it's your risk. So I think that aspect of who's in that value chain, how can we go end to end, becomes more interesting in also these elements of thinking.
I don't know whether Richard or Lionel have a view on the impact of ESG on that development.
I'm agreeing totally with Stephen. I mean, we're seeing this, you know, what many were very cynical at the beginning, saying, oh, they're just playing lip service, you know, to this, you know, environmental push and what have you, is actually turning into something a lot more than lip service. I think understanding, especially if you're in the food industry, it's always been a case of where you've had to understand, where, the raw materials originate from and what have you, but it's happening across industries. And it's, it is driven by this, an acknowledgement that things need to change, things need to improve in that sphere. So I think there is a genuine interest, but then of course, if someone gets it wrong, their business can get wrecked overnight. Consumers will just pull away.
It seems to be being driven by the larger institutions that have got the capability and to make decisions around income and revenue that some of the other institutions don't have. So, we've seen, businesses being moved on that are perfectly good from a financial position and risk perspective. And those businesses being moved on because of the ESG scoring. But businesses that are, further down the food chain, financiers that are further down the food chain, have a greater difficulty of saying, okay, we're going to make a moral judgment about a client that's representing 25% of our revenue right now. So there is the practical aspect of it. Without doubt, it's certainly beginning to impact. And also, take into account what is going on in the world right now, all the issues we've been discussing. Sometimes it's a little difficult to make decisions based upon ESG when there are so many other challenges around their portfolios to focus on that one, because sometimes there are just bigger challenges out there. And I think if it wasn't for the war in Ukraine, then I think ESG would have become an even more powerful movement in relation to financing than it has been. But I think it has been stored to an extent in relation to what is going on out there, because the overriding problem right now is the impact of the war in Ukraine and the impact that's having on fuel prices, having on inflation, so on and so forth. They are bigger issues right now to contend with, but ESG is a force, and there's no denying it.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I know when having been discussing with ESG a year ago with people, arms were bad, except of course if you're now defending a country. Fossil fuels are bad, except if you run out of gas and you've got nothing else to heat your house with. So all things are relative and it's not absolute, but clearly there has been movement in that direction, but it is creating an industry. Again, Alexander Malakat, who spoke at our Mainz conference, was saying that he specializes in ESG consultancy, and he said there are over 120 different scorecard mechanisms available now commercially to judge your business and its adherence to ESG principles. So clearly there's opportunity for a little bit of rationalization there in people's approaches. But I'm just moving on. I mean, one of the things you mentioned there, Richard, was about size. Sorry, please, Stephen.
There's a question that came in.
Yes, I was just about to move on to that.
Cool.
Sorry, thank you. Because exactly, Richard was talking about the issue here about financial power. And it needs the large corporates who are the ones who are able to actually drive these things. And we got a question from Gideon Jones, who was asking, and just wonder if fintechs have the margin to influence the change. And I'm afraid the question has disappeared from my screen now. So Stephen wanted to answer it, so I'll pass it over to Stephen.
Sorry, I was being too enthusiastic and say we answered it live. So the question was whether fintechs have the margin in their business model to make all the necessary investments in risk mitigation that we are saying is so important to withstand a consumer-led recession. If I take a first go at it, the answer would be probably not, because I think that most of the fintechs that we're seeing out there are still in the ramp-up phase, meaning they are eagerly trying to get business and flow. They've had huge investments, they've had huge expectations, huge valuations, but most of them limited business throughput. And what they've had or what they've gained takes time to mature. And I think that is one of the reasons why I'm saying we are going to see this collaboration or aggregation of some of these providers. There are too many out there. There's too much to choose from, which is good, but which is leading to the fact that many, I'm not saying all of them, but many will not be able to invest until, let's say, up to a certain level. And I think maybe, Richard, you can take it from there. But that would be my first estimate of where they stand.
I think it's a great answer, Stephen. So yeah, my only thing I would add to that is when you have the discussions in terms of what their bad debt provisioning is going to be for the next 12 months or 2 years, and they look at you blankly, you know that possibly there may be a challenge there. So I think it's a great question by Gideon. How are you, mate? I think it's also a double-sided question. I think Gideon also knows the answer, that these businesses are really just talked about revenue and talked about income and talked about how they drive, greater customer participation. They haven't talked about how you manage risk, and that good. And some of the risk management tools that I have heard talked about, seem to be focusing on the wrong things. So I think as we alluded to earlier, and Stephen has so eloquently put forward that, I think that they're going to face challenges in terms of being able to invest and deal with the heightened levels of risk that they're probably facing right now.
I'm a little bit kinder, I think. I think Stephen is absolutely right, and you're absolutely right in what you're saying. But you don't have to invest in writing a credit policy. You don't have, invest too much in terms of just taking a step and saying, what sort of business should we be doing? During this time, it's not that if they're a smaller fintech and they've got a smaller portfolio, it should be a lot easier for them to be on top of their portfolio and just take that time out to understand it. So, I think there's things that they can do which don't carry a heavy investment, in the short term, especially. What they don't often have, which is of more concern to me, is they don't have the knowledge to do it.
Yeah.
But there's a lot
Is
of
that a concern or an opportunity for you and me?
Well, of course it is. But I'd much rather, however they do it, that they do it, because the last thing you want is to see someone who sets something up and it is in its ramp up phase, and then unfortunately it fails, not because it's doing anything wrong necessarily, but because its portfolio is too concentrated, a client has gone, or they've been defrauded or something.
Okay. Right. Well, as ever with our conversations, time flies, and we're coming round to nearly the end of our allotted hour. So I'll just give the last chance to anybody in the audience to raise a question. But then I'd like to just go around the table and give this good gentleman the chance to perhaps, having reflected on the conversation that we've had, what's your key takeaway? What's perhaps the thing that you would like any of the audience to be thinking of, to be aware of, the opportunity that you see them that's available to them, or the biggest risk that they face? What do you think is the biggest takeaway if we're looking at the impact and trends on supply chain futures? What's the key thing that you want us to take away for the next 12 months? A big question, I know, but Richard, perhaps I could ask you to give your thought.
Yeah, I think it's get close to the client. I think there's been a theme from the conversations we've had between us over the last hour is really getting to understand the business that you're in, getting to understand what the client does, getting to understand where the difficulties are with those clients, and then being able to help them rather than reacting to a problem that they bring to you when it's too late. So it is really, it's get close to your client, get close to understanding. And the other point on the back of that is seek help and expertise. If you don't have that in your organization, there's a lot of good people out there that have got that. And one of the challenges certainly with some of the alternative finance businesses is that they believe they've invented the wheel, and therefore they don't have to seek help outside. So seek help and understanding through trade associations, through organizations, and through businesses that are out there to help and hopefully steer them down the right road.
Right, thank you. Lionel, how would you see that, the major take of the session?
I sort of agree with Richard. I mean, I phrased it in terms of keep the back door shut and be careful who you let in the front door during the period, for all the reasons that Richard stated. But I also think that you know, look at the future. You know, don't take your eye off on what's happening out there in the world, and I go back to digitization, the changes of law. Think about the future of how you can be set up ready for when you know those changes come into place, and how that might help your business, you know, as we come into a recovery phase of economies, which we will invariably do.
Okay, thank you. Stephen?
I'm actually quite positive for the industry, in a sense that my expectation is that there will still be loads of good business opportunities. I'm following along what Richard and Lionel were saying, and know what you're doing, keep the back door shut. But I think there's many opportunities actually to not necessarily develop new products, but revamp them in ways that will make it easier to provide financing at the right time, at the right place. And the challenge will be for providers of these kinds of solutions to find out which industries at which point in which geography that are. But I'm pretty sure there are many financing opportunities. So over the next 12 months, I'm actually expecting a lot more in terms of purchase order finance becoming available, including reverse factoring, which is an automatic repayment, not standalone, but on a flow basis, because you understand that supply chain. We're not stopping trade, right? We're slowing down a little bit, but we're not stopping. So there's loads of opportunities.
Excellent. Well, that's a very positive thought to end the conversation on. So thank you for that. Yeah, I think we would bring it to an end here. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your involvement. I think it's great that we can send the message that for the agile, for the adaptable organization, there are opportunities, but care and caution required as we go. That life does go on, and for those who are able to stand back to take advantage, then the future is positive despite all the challenges that we face. So what I'd like to say is thank you all, Stephen, Lionel and Richard, and thank you, audience, very much for participating and joining in, and look forward to our next WOA conversation in the very near future. So a great day to everybody, and thank you all very much for participating.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.